Hello and welcome to the RotoWire WNBA show, where we talk about fantasy basketball. I'm Jason Shebilske alongside Kirien Sprecher. Today, we'll talk about streaming candidates we'd like to target heading into this weekend's action. We'll also give you some players to stash, as well as outline trade strategy with just over a month left before the Olympic break. And we'll dive into this weekend's action and give you some game previews and players to add for this weekend. Those looking to test RotoWire's full slate of tools can visit rotowire.com/try for a free trial. And don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you're watching. If you have questions for us throughout the show, feel free to ask them in the comment section and we'll get them answered. We'll answer them on the show if you're watching live, but you can also ask them if you're watching afterward, and we'll reply with our answers. The Commissioner's Cup rolled on this week, and several players continue to outperform expectations, including the Sky's Chennedy Carter. She's still rostered in just 12.8% of leagues at this point. Do you have any concerns about using her as a streaming option or a season-long play, even with the Sky back to full health?
I'm treating her as a season-long play for now, right? Like, she's played at least 26 minutes in 3 straight games, starting with the game against Indiana when she made all the headlines for pushing Clark to the ground. These minutes have come at the expense of Dana Evans. I really like Dana Evans going into the season. She's kind of like underperformed in recent games, but mostly due to missing minutes. And I don't think Carter's probably going to like steal a spot from Evans ever. But I do think you can, like, I don't think Carter's going to like steal a spot or start playing 30 minutes off the bench, right? Like, I think she's locked into that sixth person role, that 6-woman role, and she's just going to thrive in that role. So I don't think you're going to see 30 plus minutes, 20 plus points per game on a regular basis, but I do think you can count on her for, 15 points and 3 or 4 assists every game, which is still a really solid fantasy player, especially for someone who's operating off the bench.
Yeah, and for as much outside talk, let's call it, that we've seen about Chennedy Carter recently, it's overshadowed the fact that she has performed really, really well for the Sky. She joined the team on a training camp contract and has absolutely performed probably beyond the Sky's wildest expectations. And yeah, like you said, even if she doesn't like see a massive role increase, I'm in a league where I have Chennedy Carter and Dana Evans, and it's not a particularly deep league, so you can kind of afford to drop players. But it sounds crazy heading into the season, but I think that if I'm dropping one of them, I'm dropping Dana Evans just because Carter has had that upside and that more consistent production that Evans has shown at times, but the consistency sometimes hasn't been there.
Yeah, I think they both probably have an equal upside, but Carter has just been super efficient and super consistent. I think Carter's like lack of 3-point shot limits her upside substantially, but like also the fact that she's scoring at such a like consistent clip without shooting threes like makes me seem like that's more reliable, right? Like she's getting to easier buckets than other players are getting in the league. So I think that she can average 12 to 16 points pretty easily, even if she's only playing 18 and 20 minutes.
Yeah, and with Evans, over the past few years, she's earned her starting role. She has worked her way into the spot, and she's performed relatively well this year while playing for the new look Sky. But Carter has just been kind of on a different level. The Wings are one of the teams playing 2 games this weekend, and they have several fantasy viable options who are still under rostered. Monique Billings is rostered in 69.6% of leagues, Maddie Siegrist in 42.9%, and Sevgi Uzun in 8.7%. Dallas will face the Sparks and Mercury this weekend. If all 3 players are available in a league you're in and you need a streaming option, how are you prioritizing them?
Probably in the order that you listed them, right? Billings, Siegrist, and then Uzun. Billings has been a double-double threat as a starter. She's averaging 15 points and 9 boards in 34 minutes per game. Consistent, reliable, like, you can trust her in your starting lineup. You don't even need to like think twice about it, even if it's a tough matchup. You're just playing Billings right now. So she's probably the number 1 in Dallas for me right now. Obviously, other than Ogunbowale, right? But then you got Siegrist, number 2. She scored in double figures in 5 straight. She's averaging 16 points per game during that stretch. She is shooting nearly 60% from the field. That efficiency probably isn't sustainable. She'll probably drop down closer to 50%. Though she is shooting only 27% from deep, so like maybe there's some variance up and down, and she stays at that clip. But I'm expecting like a slight drop in efficiency for Siegrist. So I think she's kind of like the middle of the road, not quite as consistent as Billings. And then you have Uzin. Her defense and assist production has allowed her to be a solid pickup this year. I'm playing her in some deeper leagues and consistently do, but she just doesn't have as high of an upside. You're not going to get any 40-point fantasy point explosions out of Uzin. You know, it's just going to be mostly defense, steals, and racking up assists that can give you a solid floor, but she's just not quite as high of an upside as Billings or Siegrist.
Yeah, I was talking about that league in which I have Carter and Evans, but I also have Monique Billings and Tina Charles in that league. And on nights when both players play, and like I have a full lineup, so there isn't much flexibility, I'm considering starting Billings over Charles, which is also crazy to think about because Charles is a former MVP, but Charles has performed really well. Monique Billings just has that upside that's a little bit greater at this point, and to see her performing so well after being cut before the start of the season by LA, I believe it was, like it's really encouraging for her.
Yeah, and in Dallas, we're probably going to talk about it soon, but Sabally, Howard, and Jaylen Brown are all going to be out for multiple weeks. So, you know, Billings is just going to have clear path to this consistent role for a long time coming. I think if you're debating between Billings and Charles, you're probably in a pretty good spot anyways. But for the rest of us out there, Billings is a must start probably every week at this point.
Yeah, for sure. I also have Nalissa Smith, so that used to be a conversation, but now with Bagman layout, Nalissa Smith has been on another level. We also got some encouraging news recently as Brittney Griner and Rebecca Allen practiced Thursday and are questionable for Friday. Once they're back in action, are you trusting them right away?
Yeah, I think you gotta. I have Griner in a couple of leagues where I drafted her before the injury came out, and I've been rolling with Natasha Howard, right? Or Natasha Mack, sorry. And so like I'm probably just switching Griner in for Mac if Griner gets cleared today, no questions asked, and just hoping that she plays 20 plus minutes. I don't think she would be cleared if she wasn't like capable of playing 20 plus minutes. And in 20 minutes, she can rack up a handful of rebounds, some blocks, and enough points to be a better fantasy player than Natasha Mack has been. Mack has been solid, but like you drafted Griner in that third or fourth round, maybe late second round in deeper leagues for a reason. And so if she's cleared, like I'm playing her right away. Rebecca Allen is a little more interesting because Sophie Cunningham is a really good player and has had some moments in the starting lineup. So I'm a little more hesitant there to see like if Rebecca Allen's going to go right back into the starting lineup. If Allen is in the starting lineup, I'm probably moving her into fantasy starting lineups, but a little more hesitant on Allen. Griner, I'm locking in right away.
Yeah, I might give it one game as well, like, but to see how Brittney Griner is incorporated right away. But uh, so I'm probably starting Griner, but I would probably just consider Natasha Mack a drop, basically right when Brittney Griner is back. I think Natasha Mack, she's proven to have the talent where she can still perform on occasion, but it just feels like you can probably find a more consistent option out there on your waiver wire and just someone who will provide better value as the season progresses, as long as Mac is in a backup role.
Yeah, I'm definitely dropping Mac if Griner gets cleared. I do have some other players that need to go on IR. It's a mess in the beat RotoWire league that we created, but Griner, you know, if Griner gets cleared, like she's gonna play enough minutes. Like you don't just throw a star player like that who's, you know, getting older, like she's still like capable of playing, but like you don't just like say, oh, go and play 12 minutes. Like no, she's gonna play 20 plus minutes. It might be some lack of efficiency, might be some, you know, rusty play, but she's gonna play and hopefully put up decent stats.
Yeah, and there was a brief video of yesterday's practice session, and she looked to be moving around just fine. Obviously, it'll probably be a pain tolerance issue before she's officially given the green light to go 100%, but it's good to see her back in action after her fractured toe. Before we move on to our next segment, if you enjoy content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. All right, so Kamilla Cardoso made her WNBA debut Friday against Indiana and has been on a minutes restriction over her first two professional appearances. She was more productive against the Fever on Friday than she was Tuesday against the Liberty. But how are you approaching her at this point? Are you taking a wait and see approach, or potentially reaching out to a fantasy manager to trade for her?
If I'm interested in trading for her, which I probably would be, in some leagues, you probably want to make the trade right now, right? Like she made her debut, so anybody who has her rostered is like, "Oh, that was a good debut. I'm excited." And then immediately she has two really subpar performances. So maybe a fantasy manager that was holding on to Cardozo and was like, "I'm excited. I'm gonna have a stable player." And then she comes back and she's not in that role. Maybe they're looking to get rid of her right now and you can get her for cheap because they might be thinking about like maybe potentially dropping her. Um, I I would make a trade for her right now. Depth at the forward position is always hard to come by. Like you said, we can't always have Monique Billings, Tina Charles, and I don't know who the other one you said, Melissa Smith, maybe on a single team. Like that's fantastic. We should all want to draft better, like you did. But forward position is really hard to come by. As the season progresses, like Cardoso's minutes are going to be there, right? Like we've seen some good production from Chicago's front court, but Cardozo was drafted that high for a reason. So it's another situation like Griner. Like this is a high caliber player, a star level player. She's going to get her minutes eventually. However, you can't really like sacrifice a bench spot if you are fighting for like a playoff spot. But if you've won the first couple weeks and you're chilling and you got a lot of really good starting players, you can make a trade for Cardozo now.
Yeah, and Chicago is in an interesting spot because Cardoso and Isabel Harrison both recently returned, so they've kind of been eased into action. So if you have a fantasy manager who is discouraged with that production, I think as the season progresses, there will be a lot more minutes for really both of those players. I still probably prefer Cardoso over Harrison, but if you're willing to target either one of them, I think that there could be a big payoff for you.
For sure. Harrison had a good game the other night. But I think Cardoso is the player to have. Like Harrison had 14 points and 7 boards, 2 steals yet last night. And that was like by far her best performance. Obviously Cardoso hasn't had many great performances either, but like the pedigree is there with being a high draft pick.
Right. Harrison is really hard to project because she missed all of last season with a knee injury, but she had glimpses of production in Dallas. So it was encouraging to see her put together that performance last night against the Mystics. Shifting back to the wings, they have several talented players who are currently sidelined, including Natasha Howard, Satu Sabali, and Jalen Brown. Howard and Sabali will still be sidelined for several weeks, but especially if you're near the top of your standings, are you trying to put together a trade for them at this point?
I'm not sure. Maybe Sabali is expected to be back around the Olympic break. Do we know if it was her left shoulder that she had surgery on or if it was her right shoulder?
I'm not exactly sure.
I went back.
I don't think they specified.
Yeah, I went back and looked at like the original surgery update that the Dallas released, and it didn't specify. If it's her left shoulder, she's a lefty, right? So there's the coming back from injury, getting your conditioning back, but then there's also like regaining mobility of your most important asset, which is your left arm, right? Like that. So like that's really important for me. I'm if it is her left shoulder, like and she can't like she has to take extra time to shoot following the All-Star break. I'm just really concerned about that. Howard, it sounded like she'll be back like during the Olympic break or maybe a couple days before, and then maybe like regain her conditioning during the Olympic break and then be back to go. Good to go after the break. So I'm probably like maybe trading for Howard at this point because she'll be back sooner. But it really comes down to like Sabali if it's her left shoulder or not for me.
Yeah, and like with Satu Sabali out through the Olympic break, it's a pretty short runway. There'll be just a few days left in the fantasy regular season, so you really need to count on making the playoffs. So I don't know if she's necessarily someone that I'm targeting at this point, but if you are almost a lock for the playoffs at this point, and you could get her for pretty cheap, you could look into it. But the risk that you run is that I think there are only 15 games left after she's cleared to return. And if she's limited at all, that just hinders her value even more. So I think Natasha Howard is someone that I'm looking at because I feel like if she can return before the Olympic break, that'll give her some ramp up time, like in early July, and then once they come back from the Olympics, hopefully she'll be closer to her full potential, which is one of the best players in fantasy. Does the answer change for you if you're near the back of the pack?
Yeah. I probably wouldn't make a trade for any injured players if I'm at the back of the pack, right? Like you're trying to win now. You gotta get points on the board now and win games now. I think you brought up a really interesting point though about how many games are going to be left after the Olympic break. If you're making any trades right now, you should be looking at how many games teams have left or the players you're trading for have left. You look at like the Liberty and the Fever, they've all played 11 games already. And then you look at the Aces, they've only played 7. Like 4, like that's 10, how many, 40 games, 10%. I'm not great at math, but like that's a big chunk of the season, right? 4 games. So like, you know, if you're trading, if you have Caitlin Clark right now, or you're trying to make a trade for her, you got to realize that she's already played more than a quarter of her season, while players like on the Aces have not. So it's just another variable you have to take into account. It's not like, you know, fantasy football or something where every team mostly plays every week and you are really only varied by like 1 game. Right now we have a 4-game variant. So that's an important variable to take into account when trying to make trades right now.
Yeah, Caitlin Clark is a really interesting example because since the Fever have played so many games, her total fantasy points are up there near the top. Right now she ranks number 3 in the league in terms of total fantasy points, but she's averaged 34.1 points per game with fantasy points per game, which is still a good number. It ranks her around like 15 or so. But at the same time, if you can find a manager who is a Caitlin Clark fan and you have her on your roster, you can maybe get more value than you would be able to usually, just because her total points are inflated a bit at this point, and it just kind of limits the amount of points that you'll be able to get down the road, because any games that the Fever are playing now inherently means that it'll be fewer games that they're playing down the road.
Yeah, I was looking at that same page earlier, and Arike Ogunbowale has 6 fewer points scored than Caitlin Clark, fantasy points scored than Caitlin Clark. So Arike Ogunbowale is currently 4th, but she's played 3 less games. So like Ogunbowale is clearly the better fantasy player right now. And obviously, like she's had the pedigree, the history of doing so. But it's just funny, like the variance that we have in the schedule this early in the season.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're able to get a trade like Caitlin Clark for Arike Ogunbowale, where you're receiving Ogunbowale, I would probably do that in just about a heartbeat at this point.
Especially with Dallas, all the injuries that we keep talking about, Ogunbowale is going to continue to produce at a really high clip.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have both Howard and Sably on your roster right now, which is the case for me in one league, and you need an extra roster spot, is there one that you prefer for a late season push more than the other? I think I personally prefer Howard, since she'll likely be back in action before the Olympic break, like we said. It's not a massive difference in their talent level, but I think that for me, Howard's earlier return date puts her slightly over the top for me.
So if I already have them on my roster, I know we talked about trading for them. And I'll also put another variable into that is if you're going to trade for an injured player, you should probably have your IR spot already open, right? To make use of that spot. Like it's an extra roster spot. So you should be trying to make use for it. If you have it open, you should be trying to trade for injured players. If I already have these 2 on my roster, and I need to win now and I need to open up a roster spot, I'm probably dropping Howard and moving Sably to the IR spot. I don't really like the phrasing of their return timetables. It seems a little vague. So I have 2 reasons why I'm going Sably over Howard. One, she's younger. So, you know, maybe if Dallas continues to fall down the standings, They're 3-5 right now, so it's not like, the world's ending and they've been horrible. They still have a chance to contend, especially if these players come back. But the longer they're out, the more likely it is that they'll lose games. So Sabali's younger, so a less chance that she'll be benched if they start prioritizing development over winning games. And then two, Sabali's 3-point shooting just makes her like a more prolific fantasy option in my mind. So like if you're going for a championship, Sabali gives you just a little bit higher upside. Like Natasha Howard's consistency is there, and she is a high upside player. But I think Sabali is just like one more notch ahead of her.
Yeah, and because ESPN as a standard runs daily leagues, and because the season is so short, every game matters all that much more, and every roster spot really, really matters. So if you have one in your IR spot, that means you have to have one on your bench. And so you're basically playing one player down compared to your opponent. So if you have a really strong roster, if you had a nice draft, made some good pickups, you might be able to afford that. But if you get into close games, I could see that becoming an issue for fantasy managers. It's always nice to have an ace up your sleeve, and Alicia Clark and Kate Martin have performed well for Las Vegas recently, since Chelsea Gray has remained sidelined. Not too much is known about Gray's return timetable, but Las Vegas also signed Tiffany Hayes last week. Is Hayes a player you're trying to pick up after her impressive debut, and how do you think her presence could impact Clark and Martin?
Yeah, Hayes played 21 minutes in her team debut, exceeding expectations, but I expect that to continue to grow, right? She has a history of being a good player, and, the Aces are starting to like role players. Like, I don't mean any disrespect to Clark and Stokes, but they're role players, and this Aces team is used to having 4 superstars and 1 role player, right? So I'm not calling Hayes a superstar by any means, but I do think she's a really good player. So I expect her to continue to see more and more minutes as the games go by, especially if Gray remains out, which it seems like is going to be the case. And I'm really treating Clark, Kate Martin, and Stokes as streaming options at best right now.
Yeah, I think I would maybe give it one more game if you really had Kate Martin on your radar, but it looks like her role will kind of drop off from a fantasy standpoint. For me, Clark is still kind of on my radar. She's maybe a season-long option and definitely in a 10-team league, maybe in an 8-team league as well. But otherwise, I'm just kind of streaming her in at this point. Shifting from some of the more solid options out there to some players who have had slow starts over the start of the season. Are there players who have underperformed early this year who you think could bounce back?
So Diamond Miller and Jordan Horston are like my 2 like players that I thought were gonna be solid players this year. Solid rookie seasons, solid seasons last year. Thought they were gonna take steps forward, and they're really underperforming. Obviously, in Miller's case, it has to do with an injury. So those are 2 players that like I think have high upsides. But I'm probably staying away from Miller until for the foreseeable future. She's probably got to come back and play some games and then have like a role before I consider her fantasy viable again. But I'm going to keep tabs on Horston in Seattle. She was playing like around 30 minutes, started some games early in the season. It's just gone all downhill since. They recently signed Joyner Holmes to add some, veteran front court depth. So we'll see how that works. But I still like Jordan Horston's profile. I think she's a good player and she's young. So I think like just keeping tabs on her. If she gets up into that 20-minute range again consistently, I think she could be a good solid option.
Yeah, absolutely. For the most part, I think that what we see is about what we're going to get this season, barring injuries. But Dorka Juhas is still intriguing to me, sticking with another second-year player in Minnesota. She's played off the bench while Bridget Carleton has maintained a starting role, but Carleton hasn't been particularly effective, so it wouldn't really be surprising to see Juhas's role grow at some point. The WNBA fantasy season is so short that it isn't always in your best interest to stash a player, but if you're in a deep league where Juhas is available, you could add her to the end of your bench just in case she can turn it around as the season progresses. And finally, everyone loves a good blockbuster trade. So let's say that you have a player like Brianna Stewart on your roster. if another manager offers you a 2-for-1 deal, let's say something like Marina Mabrey and Jonquel Jones, would this be something that you would consider? And does it change based on where you are in the standings?
So if I'm trying to win a championship, which you usually are when you're playing in redraft fantasy leagues, I tend to shy away from trading one of the highest scoring fantasy players, right, which would be Brianna Stewart. Uh, you want those players on your team. You're gonna win because of those types of players. I really like Mabry and Jones. I think maybe they've outplayed expectations a little bit to start this season. So I think that while you can look at their numbers right now and say that you could put them on the elite tier, I still think they're probably like one notch below the elite tier, but like right on that threshold. And so I would need two elite players in return if I'm going to trade, Asia Wilson or Brianna Stewart. We just talked about why it's a bad idea to trade for Caitlin Clark right now. But if you offered me like a Caitlin Clark, Nneka Ogwumike pairing, like those are two like top 10, 12 players in my eyes, where I feel like Mabry and Jones are probably like 15 to 18 to 20-ish. So you just got to like a little bit of upgrade in both of those, and I would be a little more interested in trading away Brianna Stewart, but you're gonna have to like pry her away from me, right? Like I'm not just gonna give her a player like that away for free.
Yeah, for me, Asia Wilson is kind of that untouchable player that Brianna Stewart was last year. Asia Wilson has just been off the charts this year. She's been incredible. Brianna Stewart, still fantastic. Any fantasy managers who drafted her, I don't think are disappointed, but I think she's displayed a little bit more inconsistency than you might like to see. So I think that I'm at least thinking about Marina Mabrey and Jonquel Jones, a trade like that, but I would probably still lean toward having Brianna Stewart. Like you said, it's never a bad option to have one of the highest scoring players in the league. And even if you have kind of an underperforming player on your bench that you would drop in favor of acquiring Mabry and Jones because you would need to get rid of another player, I think that there are probably streaming options out there that you could uh, get instead, and that might even benefit you more down the stretch because it means that you can just kind of maximize your games per week that you have.
I totally agree. And it's just one of those interesting things, right? Because in theory, if you get two players that average 20 points per game and you trade away a player averaging 30 points per game, you are plus 10 points in that trade. In theory, that's how that works until you play the person you traded in the championship game and the player that is supposed to average 30 scores 70 and your two players score 15. So I just always like to have that high scoring superstar dominate, win everything type of player.
Yeah, for sure. So looking ahead to this weekend, it's a pretty packed slate. We have 4 games tonight, Friday. We have 2 games tomorrow on Saturday, and we have 4 games again Sunday. What are some matchups that you're looking forward to seeing this weekend?
So we get to see Caitlin Clark again on Friday. We talked on Monday how they had this long rest and maybe they got some practice time in for the first time this season because they've just played so many games and they're playing a winless Mystics team. Maybe a chance for Caitlin to, have some fireworks and put up a big score. But in reality, Indiana just needs like a solid all-around team win, right? That would probably be the best for their trajectory moving forward, though it would be entertaining if we saw Clark drop 30 again. Moving on to Saturday, you got the Liberty and Connecticut Sun. That's must-watch TV in my mind. Two contenders should be a great battle. The Liberty we're 3-0 in the Commissioner's Cup Commissioner's Cup, so like they're cooking, and Connecticut's undefeated, so that should be really fun. And then one player to watch throughout the weekend is another rookie, Cameron Brink. She matches up against Monique Billings and Tierra McCowan on Friday, and then she faces the player you were just mentioning, Asia Wilson, on Sunday. That should be two really tough tests for the rookie. But I think she's up to the fight, and she played pretty well against Wilson last time they matched up and had a couple blocks. So looking forward to those matchups for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really exciting to see the just increased competition level on top of what was already there during the Commissioner's Cup. For me, I'm excited to see the Storm and the Lynx on Sunday. Minnesota took both of the games to begin the season, but Seattle really looks like a more cohesive team now. The Lynx are still a formidable opponent, but I think that this will be a test for both teams and just kind of a way to gauge where they are at this point of the season, because both have been hot in recent weeks. So we'll see which one we can kind of rank above the other in our power rankings. And then finally, who are some streaming candidates that you like for this weekend?
I mean, Tiffany Hayes jumps out at the pay. I picked her up in all of the leagues that I'm in right after I heard the signing. Well, that's not true. 2 leagues I picked her up right after I heard the signing, and then one I waited because I had a guard playing that I didn't want to drop. I think it might have been Uzin or Van Loo. But then I switched it out. I think, Tiffany Hayes, I don't even really view her as a streaming option. I think she's a season-long play moving forward, at least until Gray comes back. So maybe like a semi-season long holder. That's not really a good adjective, but really interested to see how her role grows over the weekend.
Yeah, this weekend is really interesting because there are a bunch of teams who play 2 games. You have the Liberty, Mystics, Wings, Sparks, Mercury, Aces, Storm, and Lynx. So that's over half the league. So it feels like if you have empty spots in your lineup on Friday or Sunday, you're probably losing out on the numbers battle on those days against your opponent, because there are just so many players who will be playing 2 games. But in addition to Tiffany Hayes, I really like Sevgi Uzun because she's just available in a bunch of leagues. So you can probably get her and maybe get 15 to 20 points. And Aaliyah Edwards. Shakira Austin is going to remain out Friday. Her status isn't yet known for Sunday. So Aaliyah Edwards had a career best game Thursday against the Sky. And if she can keep up her momentum, I think that she could really provide a boost over the weekend.
Are we starting to worry about Austin? Is that this will be her 4th game missed or 3rd game missed? I know this was a back-to-back situation.
Yeah,
she's
this
been
will be
limited.
her.
I'm a little worried about her. She's been limited to hasn't played more than 25 minutes in a game. When she's on the court, she's been pretty strong. I'm just worried that we're never going to get to see the full go Shakira Austin this season.
Yeah, this is going to be her 3rd game missed in a row and her 5th game total.
Okay, wow.
So yeah, it's a pretty crazy thing. Kirk Sear 1234 was watching Monday's show and actually asked a question of whether we think Shakira Austin is droppable. Now, this was before she had 2 more absences to her slate, but it's been really frustrating. The problem with Shakira Austin is that she's been really efficient when on the court. So she isn't necessarily a must-drop player, but I wound up dropping her in a 6-team league that I'm in because there are just kind of better options available at this point, where if you're in an 8 to 10 team league, I could see keeping her around, but it's a tough thing at this point because, like we said, each game really, really matters in WNBA Fantasy because it's such a short season. So when she keeps on missing games, it feels like she isn't close to being back to like 100% anytime soon. So I would feel pretty comfortable dropping her at this point.
Especially if you're like a 6-team league or something and Billings is still available for whatever reason. Like Billings has played 33, 40, 28, 36, 34, 32 minutes as starter. So even if like Austin strings out like 6 or 7 games played in a row, she's still only going to play 20 to 25 minutes. So I don't know. I'm starting to get a little worried that her big step forward this year is going to be all for naught if she can't stay on the court regularly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a question from Julian Rutten. Thanks for this question. How do we feel about Cheyenne Parker-Tyus? She's off to a bit of a slow start, and he's thinking of trading her, assuming that she'll pick it up.
Yeah, I think a fair assumption that she'll pick some production up. I know Tina Charles is obviously there now, which limits some of Parker's upside. But last year, Parker scored 15 points a game, 6.7 boards, nearly 2 assists, and 2.6 stocks per game. So this is like an all-around player, right? Like she does everything, and she does everything well. It's been a rough stretch. She did actually start out fast. She scored in double figures in 4 or 5 to start the season, but has not in the last 3. So I think if you can get her for fairly cheap, an increase in production over her last 3 games is almost guaranteed. And but she probably won't quite get to that like 15.8 rebound, 2.5 stocks player like she was last year because of the presence of Tina Charles.
Yeah, and I think that it really depends on who you're trading away to get her. So
Yeah.
I think that she does have some value. She's displayed her upside by scoring at least 20 fantasy points on 3 occasions, but she's also displayed a little bit of a lower floor than she has in past seasons because she just doesn't have as much playing time as usual. So she's had under 20, well, she's had 10 points and 13 points at times. So those aren't really numbers that you're looking for out of a player of her caliber. And she does have the talent to turn things around. But I think that with Tina Charles and especially Ryan Howard still sticking around, it's it's a tough thing for me to think about like trading for her unless if you're like really able to get a bargain. If someone's just ready to move on from Cheyenne Parker Tyus and you're able to give her someone to give the other manager someone like maybe off the end of the bench, I would consider that. But she isn't necessarily a player that I'm targeting just because I think that the reason for the lack of upside is there because the the Dream also added Nia Coffey. Oh, sorry, they already had Nia Coffey, but they added Aerial Powers, who has been inconsistent at times, but that's just another player who's taken minutes away from Parker when Parker maybe had those minutes in the past.
I agree. But I think one more like key part of this equation is Parker's just been in a lot of foul trouble. I didn't realize this. The 2 games that she didn't play over 20 minutes, she had 5 fouls in each of those games, or 5 fouls, and then she fouled out in one of those games. She's averaging over 4 fouls per game, which actually went down in this last game. Yesterday, she only committed 1 foul. So I do think like while the drop in minutes is a little concerning, she hasn't played 30 minutes in a game yet. Those 2 like real duds in minutes were foul trouble related. So I do think that you make a good point that Tina Charles and the other additions are going to limit Parker's upside, but I think it's a fair assumption that she's improvements coming, especially if she can stay out of foul trouble.
Yeah, and she has solid scoring and rebounding potential. So if she can keep that up, I think that she could be a pretty consistent option for you down the stretch, just maybe a little bit less upside than we're used to seeing in previous seasons.
For sure.
Thanks so much for that question, Julian. That does it for our Friday show. We'll be back on Monday at 1 o'clock Central, where we'll talk about some of our favorite waiver wire options. Be sure to join us then, and thanks for watching.